Mr. Buckley and I have been comrades in arms for the conservative cause for 4 decades.
Have I offended anybody?
What kind of a crazy Roman Catholic priest would set up an operation in the bastion of 5-point Calvinism, the true faith, right here in Grand Rapids?
Good evening, and welcome to the Acton Institute's 30th anniversary celebration. For 30 years, we've been gathering friends and supporters from all over the world to a gala gathering with a very nice meal here in Grand Rapids. Now, unfortunately, we can't do this evening, but we've still dressed up for the occasion, and we welcome all of you for joining us here. Tonight, we're going to have a lot of reminiscences about some of our successes and the importance of our mission, and we're glad you're here with us. We'll be together for 1 hour. Part of that conclusion of the 1 hour will be a toast that we'd like you to join with us on the 30th anniversary. So feel free to get your favorite beverage and a glass in order to join us. Now, as I mentioned, we've had 30 years of terrific gala dinners.
Yes.
A lot of great memories. I wonder, Father, what some of your most vibrant memories have been.
Well, I mean, right from the beginning, it was amazing. We invited William F. Buckley Jr. to come to Grand Rapids and had Russell Kirk introduce him. Russell Kirk was one of the two founders of the conservative movement in the United States. That was a great time. And, of course, then we had Chuck Colson just after that. I think that was the next one up. We had 2 Supreme Court justices, Scalia and Thomas.
Scalia was particularly funny.
It was so funny. People laughed through the whole dinner. He is just a very smooth, well, it's that Italian, East Coast way of communicating.
When did you become a textual? What caused you to become a textualist? When did you begin eating human beings? As though it's some. You will always have willful judges, but the difference was in the good old days, they had the decency to lie about it. They would. Americans say, when an efficient government is gridlock. Yes, that's what they meant it to be.
And talking about Italian East Coast ways of communicating, my brother, who was the one of the stars on The Sopranos, which I know none of you watched. Paulie Walnuts, came and introduced me at the 20th anniversary dinner, and that was hysterical.
As you know, I am Father Robert Sirico's brother Tony, who has played a lot of gangsters in the movies and on television. But I've also played a couple of cops, if it makes you feel any better. And just because he founded a think tank, whatever the hell that is, forgive my French, my brother, Father Robert Sirico, president of the Acton Institute, and a real priest. Father?
Father, we've been doing this for 30 years. Some of the questions we've had from the audience have been to tell us about your story, because what some people know about you is that you used to be on the left.
Yeah.
How did you go from the left to founding a free market think tank?
Well, that is a long and complicated story, and when I retire, I'm going to write all the bad and the ugly about it. But the short version of it is that when I was involved with activism on the left, I was living in California at the time. I knew Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden.
Actually, I have a couple of pictures.
Yeah, there's nothing with me and
This
her.
is Jane and Tom Hayden.
Yes, yeah.
And this is Hanoi
They're a
Jane.
little- yeah.
This is a famous picture. that
This would
people-
be about the period, and then this was just before. That's the famous shot of her in Vietnam. But then Tom Hayden was one of the Chicago 8, and I was involved in the movement for economic democracy, plus all kinds of other left-wing movements in California, the women's movement, the gay movement, the farm workers' boycott of Gallo grapes, and things like that. But then I met somebody who gave me some books to read and was patient enough to have a series of arguments with me over about 6 months.
What were some of those books?
I'm always asked that. Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Friedrich Bastiat's The Law, which is a wonderful little book that helps you to learn how to think, not what to think. I read Ayn Rand. I always joke and say Ayn Rand led me back to the Catholic Church, which would excite her.
Sounds kind of scandalous.
Yes. Well, she knows better now. And Hayek and Mises, of course, and a plethora of other books. And slowly the light began to go on in the room.
So you had kind of a political conversion and actually a religious
That
conversion.
led to, this has got to be, since St. Augustine, the most interesting and convoluted conversion in Christian history. It was that political conversion first, because in that I understood the importance of private property and the importance of private property because of the dignity of the human person and the necessity of human beings to be free. And then I began to think more profoundly about the nature of the human person, and that bumped me back into God. And everything I had learned as a child came flooding back, and then I returned to my faith. And it wasn't until years later, after I'd been through seminary, that we began the Acton Institute. But it has always given me a sensitivity to people who disagree with our ideas, because I know that not all of them are insincere or evil. A lot of people are just confused about how a market economy functions, why private property isn't selfish.
You went to seminary. What was your experience in seminary, and how did that inform our early discussions about what Acton should do?
Well, you remember some of that, because
Yeah.
that's about the time that we met. And when I went to seminary, now remember, I've had this change politically, and when I go to seminary, there's so much. This is in the early 1980s, so liberation theology was still
Right.
quite the thing. Nicaragua and everything going on with the Sandinistas and all of that happening. And I really began to read the left-wing corpus and discuss it with mentors and theologians, and of course lots of debates with my seminary brothers. I remember I went to visit Johns Hopkins University to speak at the chaplaincy there, and that's where I met this man who was very curious about these ideas. And we forged a friendship, and then eventually the formation of the Acton Institute, and that man would be you.
It's been a long history
You
we've
were
had together.
18 years
That's right.
old.
So it's 35 years ago.
Yeah.
Now. So we began talking about the importance of engaging these ideas, especially in the religious community, because they had given the moral high ground to Marxism, truly, in the form of liberation theology.
No, you're right, because a lot of the books that I read on the free market, these were all utilitarian books, and they're true, and the practical experience of how markets benefit people. But the thing that impassions people are movements like liberation theology, which are an appeal
To justice.
to
and
justice
morality.
and morality.
And so we'd had some of those conversations, and we won't give all the details here, but you invited me to move to Grand Rapids, which I had heard of but hadn't ever visited. At the end of '89, those conversations taking place, beginning of 1990.
And by the way, it's important for people to remember what was going on in 1989. I mean, there was Tiananmen Square, with
Yes.
which you had some familiarity because of your time in China. We'll probably talk a little bit about that. But also the fall of communism.
Absolutely. And so we began this conversation, and when we made the agreement for me to move here, it was going to be the Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty.
Right.
And when I arrived, you said, I've decided we should rename it to the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. And I guess in all honesty, I didn't know who Lord Acton was.
Yes, but you knew his quotes.
I did know his quote, the famous quote, which is,
Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
now everybody seems to know this quote, but a lot of people seem to get it wrong.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Absolute power corrupting absolutely.
Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely.
This misquote keeps appearing everywhere.
Everywhere. Once I met Margaret Thatcher right at the beginning of the Acton
Father,
Institute.
I have,
Do you have Maggie?
I have that memory here.
You
I was
know-
going to ask you about that.
And that photo was taken right about the time that I had to correct her. Because when I was introduced to her, she said, "Oh, Acton Institute." She said, "Lord Acton said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And I said, and she was just made lady just prior to this, and I said, "Well, Lady Thatcher, actually what Lord Acton said was power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And she looked up at me and she said, "Just so."
Well, you mentioned the fall of real communism in the former Central and Eastern Europe, and one of the first things we did was go to Central and Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
We responded to a couple invitations to go, and you and I packed up, I think, 2 big steamer trunks full of books,
Yes.
literally the same books that had such an impact on your life and mine too. And we brought them there, and I remember a lot of
Poland and Hungary.
the Czech Republic,
Czechoslovakia
at that time. You're right. And I remember there's so many things I remember about that, but one of them was just the spontaneous gatherings of people who had heard we were coming and kind of came to hear us speak and take our books. One of the interesting stories I remember when one of the invitations we responded to was some people in Hungary who had sent a fax, which I don't know that we have fax machines anymore, but someone had sent us a fax at the beginning of Acton saying, "We've discovered that you are the Acton Institute, and we're so honored to meet you. We would love to have you come here because, don't you know, Lord Acton was instrumental in the downfall of communism in Hungary."
That was amazing.
Which was extraordinary. None of us had heard that story before. But when we went, we were told in that stooge parliament just before the fall of communism, somebody had the bravery to stand up and invoke that very quote, "Power tends to corrupt." But those folks had actually created a whole society, the Lord Acton Society, in Budapest to promote the ideas of this Acton Institute. The other thing that struck me those days was, in Prague in particular, there were only government-run restaurants.
Yes.
And the food was terrible.
There were a few free market restaurants. They were
just emerging.
Just emerging.
But you had to seek
and
and
there were
find.
2 kinds of wine, red and white.
Right.
It was communist wine.
So this begs a question. I know most of the folks watching us here tonight don't need this lesson in the evils of communism. But why is that so? How would it be that a political and economic system could take those beautiful cities and turn them into dark, dirty places without choice and flourishing of the citizens?
Do you remember when we were traveling through all these countries, I said, I think there was one architect for the whole thing, because these big communist buildings, they were depressing. I think the reason for that, it really kind of goes to the heart of the Acton Institute's contention, that it's an anthropological problem. It's what John Paul II said in his encyclical. The way communism, Marxism views the human person is deadening. And you see it not just in the economy, which falls apart, not just in the spirit of people, which is depressed, but you also see it in its aesthetic. The buildings that they build and the artwork that they produce, these are all very blockish and
utilitarian.
Cruel, utilitarian.
And even without discussing the moral dimension, markets and competition helps tutor people working in those environments to be other regarding toward customers.
Yeah, and I often felt in those shops of that era that when you walked into a shop or a restaurant that you were somehow disturbing the proprietors, that you were in there and you had to kind of beg for service. Once these little independent restaurants began serving all kinds of food and even importing some wine, things began to change rapidly because all of the state restaurants went out of existence. I mean, by the time we were there, within a year later, when he had gone back, it had all changed in this wonderful tradition of, in this case, Slovakian cooking and things like that.
Well, you mentioned that we'd returned to Prague. In fact, we saw over at least 10 years in a row, we did an annual conference outside of Prague.
Yes.
And so we saw in real
must
time.
have a picture
I
of
do.
that somewhere.
I do
Here
have
it
one
is.
of those. There it is. And real time transformation of that country.
Yeah.
And sort of free markets competing and crushing the state
Right.
enterprises there for the betterment of everybody.
Right.
And obviously it was a rather inexpensive place to do programming. They were
Right.
begging us to come do
Yes.
things, and we went to a beautiful monastery outside of Prague in
was
Olomouc, as
magnificent.
you recall, and had a gathering every year for seminarians and young priests from throughout Central and Eastern Europe, trying
Yes.
to give them an orientation to the importance of freedom, which they knew, but they didn't have the framework and
Right.
and kind of the guardrails that we were putting in place ideologically.
With some very interesting alumni came out of that. I don't know that there's anybody in these photos that I'm thinking
It was
of. in
Father
particular.
Kostusas.
Is that
here.
Father Kostusas in the middle?
Yeah.
Oh, now Bishop Kostusas, the bishop, a bishop in
Archbishop of Kaunas now.
yes, in Lithuania.
So that's a great example, Father, of what we're trying to accomplish. When we
Exactly.
began Acton, we recognized there were two leveraged audiences in every society that needed our synthesis of faith and freedom. One clearly was the religious community, and you experienced
Right.
that in the seminaries, and we saw it writ large in liberation theology, this great misunderstanding of the role of freedom and free markets.
In fact, when we began the Institute, I remember taking a few days away and I wrote two basic foundational essays. The one was Toward a Free and Virtuous Society, which was directed at religious thinkers, religious academicians, to establish the foundation of a free society and the moral importance of freedom. But then the other one, which is I think where you're going, was the entrepreneurial vocation, importance of outreach to this other group of leaders, business people who are the engine of economic progress in society. And if they don't have a sense of moral vocation, then they become victims of bureaucracies and politics.
If we had $1 for every time a business person had told us how they felt marginalized in their churches because of their success in business, we would never have to fundraise again. So,
Right.
But we still need to fundraise. Nonetheless, Father, can you talk about some of those stories, examples when we've kind of touched business leaders in a way that was
very much, and this has happened all over the world, whether it's in Italy or Eastern Europe, or for instance, one instance in the Bahamas. I was giving a lecture to it was a business luncheon, and after I was done basically articulating our view about the vocation of business people.
That's the Bahamas there.
Yes. I remember this man stood up and said, "Father," and I could see the moment he stood up, everybody kind of turned and looked, so they all knew who he was. I didn't know who he was. Turns out he was the owner of a line of supermarkets in the Bahamas, and he said, "I have been a faithful churchgoer all of my life. My family and I go on a regular basis, but I have become fed up with the way I'm treated in the sermons that I hear in my church, denouncing business." There was a strike that was endorsed by his own pastor against this man's supermarket. He said they were demanding that every worker be able to buy free groceries, be able to take free groceries from the store. And he said, "This is the first time I've heard a man of the cloth speak respectfully and intelligently about my vocation." He said, "The only time they ever call me is when they want money from the business that they're denouncing." I think that encapsulates exactly the clash and the dilemma that we're trying to resolve through the work of the Acton Institute.
Two things strike me about that story. One is the impact on that man and that great injustice done to him, who was the way that people normatively got their food, literally, in society. But the other thing was the real economic ignorance on the part of that pastor and the culture writ large. I mean, play out that scenario. What happens if everyone gets free groceries?
Right.
Obviously, the store goes out of business, and
all the employees.
And there are no groceries.
But understand it from the side of the pastor, right? This pastor, how does he get his money? He collects it. And what does he do with it? Then he redistributes it. So he just figures, you need to model your grocery store on the way I run the church.
Right. No, that's a great story of the work we've done. And from the beginning, we knew we needed to be international as well as domestic. And of course, work with business leaders and pastors in those different ways. But, we mentioned there's also this broad economic ignorance in society against free markets. And that needs to be combated, and not combated just in a utilitarian way, but in a moral defense. And we've done that as well. There are many incidences. Part of our whole work is trying to engage the public intellectual space in our country through TV and nowadays through blogs and podcasts, etc. But over the years, we've had lots of success in getting you and other of our key employees on TV shows, for example, engaging with these ideas at a very high level. One of the other things we've been able to do is to challenge these bad ideas literally at the seat of power.
There are a number of clips we even took off of C-SPAN, I think, of the times I testified at Congress and at the Senate.
When the planet is facing all these problems, it's not a moral issue. I
never said that. Where did I say that? Could you give me that quotation,
Senator?
Senator?
You just said it, sir.
I did not.
Sir, you received money from the
not.
Koch brothers, from Exxon.
The point is that we exist for the purpose of helping people understand the moral foundations of the free economy. And it's a shame that one has to come to the United States Senate to make that case and to be opposed on it.
You're against funding for religious organizations. That wasn't just generally, was it? You didn't mean Catholic charities.
I am against federal funding for religious organizations. I was asked whether it would be good to funnel money through religious organizations in order to accomplish these things.
The way we do it here is that we give federal credits. That is, people don't have to pay taxes if they give to the church, which is really, subsidizing.
No, I don't think that's a subsidy at all. That's only a subsidy if you presume that the money is yours in the first place.
So we've had a lot of adventures as well over the years. You might say adventures in Marxism, where we have found ourselves in some very interesting places.
Really?
You've been to Cuba. I haven't been, but you've been twice, I think, to Cuba. We've been both together multiple times to Venezuela and China, where obviously then and now these places are all still suffering under real Marxism.
Yeah.
Some of these are a little bit sensitive, but we can share, I guess, some of the stories. One of the most remarkable things we did, and we can phrase it in a very general sort of way, but it's all truthful, is that we broke into a communist prison in a third world country and freed a political prisoner.
Something like that. What we did was we drove up to this, it's called the Labyrinth. If you see it, it's this kind of circular, hideous...
Very ominous-looking prison.
Yeah. And there was a gentleman who was the mayor of one of the sections of Caracas who was in jail. And he was very interesting, Mr. Capriles. So we drove up and talked our way into the prison. I remember when the guard came, he said, "Who are you?" And the driver we had said, "Oh, this is Father Sirico from the Vatican," or something like that. And they said, "I want ID." So I pulled out my business card from our Rome office. So it had the Italian stuff. And then they let us in. I can't believe it.
And I pulled out my Blue Cross Blue Shield card, and I was from the International Red Cross Special Investigative Division.
Yes, the Blue Cross.
Blue Cross. Yeah.
So they let us in, and we met. I met Mr. Capriles and talked about his family. His grandmother was a survivor of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And I remember going back from Venezuela that day. I was on the plane, and I began writing an article that appeared later that week in the Wall Street Journal.
But not just that, it appeared simultaneously in about 20 countries
In Spanish.
In Spanish, which created a groundswell of concern and consciousness raising, which shortly thereafter he was released from prison.
Yes, and they said they thought that the article had something to do with that. So that was very satisfying.
You know, when we began Acton, of course, we're both Catholic, but our first assumption from the beginning was that we would be interfaith. And so our very first conferences, we intentionally went out of our way to bring people representing all kinds of different faith traditions from the beginning. But speaking of the Catholic Church, we knew we were on the outside of the institutions.
Yes.
The seminaries, obviously, you just survived one of those. The Catholic colleges and even high schools, probably to a large extent.
And the Bishops' Conference.
And the Vatican itself.
And the Vatican.
We assumed that we were never going to have an official hearing, be at the table. So what we did from the beginning was say, we're going to work on the next generation.
Right.
So we targeted seminarians, again, not just Catholic ones, but young people who were going to be the future shapers of the moral consensus.
Right.
But something happened along the way, Father. So, I mean,
Well,
we started assuming that we wouldn't have a place at the table.
It happened
but
right
then
at
what
the beginning because, again, going back to that year, 1989, 1990, that was the collapse of communism. John Paul II, who had his own experience with communism and Nazism, another form of collectivism, wrote an encyclical, Centesimus Annus, which is the defense of the free society. And boy, I felt like if this encyclical was out, I might not have started the Acton Institute.
Right.
Because you have it all right there. And what that did was open doors for us to get to know people. Now, again, we're talking in the Catholic context, but to actually collaborate with the Vatican and the publication of the social agenda, which we presented to John Paul II because of my association with Cardinal Francis Xavier Nguyen Van Thuan, who died, but he was made a cardinal before he died, who spent 13 years in a communist prison.
Right.
11 of them, I believe, or 9 of them in solitary confinement. And he then became the head of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. And then other bishops and archbishops that we were able, and then similar work in the Protestant world.
You know, this kind of begs the question, we talk a lot about the importance of economic freedom, but there is a connection between economic freedom and religious freedom.
Well, on the moral level, it's anthropological, the dignity of the person. But on a practical level, if you don't have the right to private property, you can't have your institution. You can't have a church building. If you don't have the right to private property and religious freedom, the right to assemble and organize, then you can't affect the society in which you live through the charitable institutions that historically Christians have invented in a very real and serious way. And we see that battle being played out over and over again, historically and even in the present. So if you don't have a free society, you can't be free.
You know, very early on in Acton's history, 96, I believe, we did a major conference in Washington, D.C. on welfare reform.
Yes.
And we'd had some role, to be truthful, in helping to draft I remember the Senate law, the welfare reform bill that Bill Clinton had was on the correct side of, in a sense. But one of the things that conservatives get accused of is having no heart for the poor.
Right.
And we often talked about in those days that welfare, the problem with welfare wasn't that it was too generous, that we're giving things to people, but that it was too stingy.
Yes.
Tell me why we would say such a thing.
Well, first of all, it's a misnomer to think that as a percentage of the federal budget that it goes to welfare. It's only a fraction of it. The real deleterious effect of welfare is on the families, on the people themselves, and on the institutions of charity and people in general in terms of their philanthropic giving, because people assume the government's going to provide everything for people anyway, so we don't have to do it. And you see the kind of withdrawal of religious institutions from this social sector, or at least the control of the state through various government programs and subsidies of religious institutions that become gradually more and more secular. You have to have religious institutions for at least two reasons. One is they're more proximate to the needs that people have. And the second reason is that it places the religious community back in the position of moral influence in the culture itself. If we move ourselves out or just become contractors for the welfare state, we lose a source of our spiritual nourishment, and society loses the moral voice that is very often the thing that heals broken families or broken lives. So, the whole principle of welfare that disregards the private sector, the voluntary sector, is harmful for society.
One of the great misunderstandings about important social concerns, healthcare, or even the environment. People are concerned that those shouldn't be left to the private sector.
Right.
It's too dangerous, that somehow government has to lead those efforts, and they should be sort of collective efforts.
Well, and this touches on the question of private property, which was one of the first lessons I learned way back when I was still a new lefty. And that is that people tend to their property more rigorously if it's their property.
Right.
And if it's public, you have the tragedy of the commons. Nobody wants to go to a public restroom if you can avoid it, because
Sure.
nobody owns it. The problem with the environment is the externalities is precisely the case because property rights haven't been clearly defined. So if I pollute you, you can't necessarily sue me.
Right.
Again, markets increase intelligence because it increases voluntary cooperation, and even the price system itself tells you about the relative scarcity of resources or the relative abundance of those resources. When we began, it was just you and me, and we found that little apartment above a flower shop, 2 bedrooms. That was the beginning of the Acton Institute, and all of our staff could fit in one of those rooms. And it's amazing, it seems to me, our staff has changed and grown, and it's only we who haven't gotten any older over the years. It's amazing.
Sometimes, the old question about the acorn and how it has its own sort of logic and trajectory. I think I can see that looking back at the life of Acton. We certainly did not presume explicitly all the different programs that we have today back in those days.
No, we had a mission. We had a clear idea of what we wanted to accomplish, and then we were happy to try experiments with anything that would work, and we hit upon a few.
Now, we did actually, we're very clear on our theory of change. We had both been
Right.
enamored by Friedrich Hayek's essay, The Intellectuals and Socialism,
Yes.
which laid out the strategy of how societies change.
Yeah.
And he had observed how the socialists had captured culture and the intellectual life in Europe.
And he places the importance on what he calls the second-hand dealers in ideas.
Which he explicitly mentioned included pastors.
Clergy, yes, yeah. And so all of these people would take the information that scholarship would produce and, so to speak, popularize it. And so that's what we began doing, both in terms of the scholarship, but in terms of targeting groups that could amplify the message because of their own constituencies, their own voices.
Right. Now, in a way, we have kind of established this very integrated intellectual project that starts with original scholarship and books, publications, a whole team of research scholars led by, these days, Sam Gregg for more than 20 years, who is now known the world over for his great scholarship. So in addition to the books, we've been known, of course, for our many student conferences, beginning with our Tour de Free and Virtuous Society programs.
I remember the first one, we had them on back-to-back weekends, because that saved money in terms of bringing people in to speak at it. And Justice Scalia's son, now Father Paul Scalia, was at the first one when he was a seminarian, before he was a seminarian, I think, and a number of other people who have since become great friends of ours. And it grew from that 20-person seminar that we kept doing and doing and doing. And then we wanted to incorporate more of our alumni. And after about, 10, 15 years?
15 years, because we're now on our 15th anniversary, I think, if I know where you're going.
Yes, yeah. So after about 15 years, we created a seminar that became Acton University. So from those small Tour de Free and Virtuous Society conferences, we now have this behemoth called Acton University, over 1,000 people from how many different countries?
80 plus countries annually. The application pool is much larger, of course, but we're limited by the number of people we can welcome.
I always joke saying we have everything from Mormons to Muslims, but we do, seriously. We have a large Jewish contingent, representatives of the Islamic faith, a whole wide assortment of mainstream Protestants, evangelical Protestants, and Roman Catholics.
You know, one of our viewers has submitted a question asking us, thank you for this question, what do we consider to be some of the most effective programs we've had over the years?
It would have to be those series of seminars from the Tour de Free and Virtuous Society, and then we created a version of that directed at people who serve in the inner city, social work and direct aid to people in need, called Tour de Free and Virtuous City. Largely those people have never been to anything remotely like a conference dealing with free markets. Then it grew into Acton University, and last year Acton University, actually this year, the beginning of this year with COVID, we pivoted and changed, and we did a whole online presentation with not 1,000 participants, but over 4,000 from 90 countries.
Yes.
At that point. I would say that's successful, but also our work in terms of reclaiming the moral voice for the poor, taking it back from the state.
You know, people ask us, how do we know a program is effective? And we have lots of ways we measure the effectiveness of our programs. One of the most important ways to measure change of mind and heart, which is not obviously apparent, is when people write us testimonials. And we get them on almost a weekly basis, people who say their lives have been changed by an encounter with Acton's programs. There's a great quote here. I'm going to, if I can just read it, because it speaks to many of the things you just mentioned. Here it is. I confess I went to Acton University as a disillusioned communist leading intellectual, desperately wanting to help my poor inner city church. I left with a fire to help the poor, but more importantly, a framework to actually help them. There are many changed lives in the inner city of Houston because of Acton University. And that says it all, right?
That
That's
really
exactly what we like to see.
We've had incredible alumni over the years who have testified to this in so many different and varied contexts.
We have another question from our viewers tonight, which is, how can we help? What can we do as followers and supporters of Acton extend your mission?
You extend our mission by extending the knowledge of it to your friends and neighbors, especially your pastors or people that you're at a book club with or in some other kind of association. Give them a piece of our literature. Show them a clip from Poverty Cure. We have really spent these 30 years developing tools to extend. So you need to be our social network. You need to tweet about what we're doing and tell other people about it. I think that's the way to do it. Over these years, the technology has changed. I remember when we began, I got the first fax machine for the office. And I remember my first email coming in. And that, in a way we didn't anticipate, but exploited, enabled us to increase our audiences incredibly. Poverty Cure would be an example of that. This is a whole outreach in terms of changing the narrative on poverty. So it's Poverty Cure for missionaries and church groups, and Poverty Inc. for the
broad audience.
I don't know if we want to tell our supporters that Michael Moore thought it was a great, we'll keep that a secret.
But Poverty Inc. wasn't the first documentary we'd done. We'd done at least 2 major ones before, beginning with Call of the Entrepreneur, which basically was a film version of that very first monograph that you talked about writing in 1990. Right?
Yes, the monograph and then the production filmed all over the world with intriguing entrepreneurs in it, including someone we'll honor tonight, Jimmy Lai. But that really was a very powerful defense of the entrepreneur.
So we talked about our research and our student programs, but finally we've quite successfully created a number of film products, including curriculum, that we use to equip these people that we've trained through our various educational programs.
And we're working on a few more, even as we sit here, but the other interesting thing is the way in which the social media has been able to amplify everything we have. We have, what do we always say? Most groups are not as good as their PR.
Right.
We're much better than our PR.
That's right.
Because we just getting this stuff out, and this is what the social media has enabled us to do, to just do tweets or Facebook posts or various other types of social media. Yeah, I'm often asked what you do with your pastor. If he or she is preaching from the pulpit the kinds of things that we know are wrong-headed and irritating. And the thing I can say to you is, give your pastor a copy of our books or our videos. Sometimes they won't read them, sometimes they will. Sometimes preachers especially are in search of homiletical topics, and we've designed a whole bunch of our material to help them make the integration that we've spent 30 years trying to do here.
And we shouldn't always assume that they're going to be enemies of these
true.
ideas. Most often, in our experience, they're just ignorant. They just haven't been exposed to reasonable arguments of free enterprise for solving, our problems in this country. An important part of many of these anniversary dinner celebrations we've held over the last 30 years has been the bestowing of our Faith and Freedom Award, which we announced for the first time in the year 2000. And since then, we've given 10 awards. And they've gone to some of the most outstanding examples of the defense of faith and freedom that one can imagine, including people we've talked about tonight, such as Margaret Thatcher,
Francis Xavier Nguyen Van Thuan, who we mentioned was in a communist prison camp in Vietnam,
and Justice Scalia, who we mentioned earlier tonight. Tonight, we're pleased and proud to give it to another very worthy recipient.
When you live in a communist country, surrounded by all the lies, how horrible, how hellish the outside world is, you're scared about the outside world. We were unfortunate because our family was rich. So naturally, when you're rich, you become the enemy. I knew that the adults were sent to labor camp, For instance, my mother only came back during weekends to take care of us. After weekends, she had to go back to labor camp. I was maybe 4. I didn't know what was going on. We just had to survive, struggle as a kid. When I was 8 and 9, I worked in the railway stations. Working in the railway stations gave me the privilege to access people who come from outside. One day I was carrying the baggage for a guy. After he gave me some tips, he fell into his pocket and gave me a bar of chocolate. And I was so hungry, I turned and I bite. And it was so tasteful. It was amazing. So I turned and I asked him, I said, what's this? It's chocolate. I said, where are you from? He said, Hong Kong. I said, Hong Kong must be heaven because I never taste anything like that. I said to myself, I want to leave this place. I want to go to Hong Kong. I want to go to the outside world. The outside world definitely is much better. I start to pester my mother about allowing me to go, to Hong Kong. She always said that, that going to Hong Kong is like you going to the moon because I would never see you again. She was very reluctant to allow me to go to Hong Kong, but finally I did, and when I was 12 and a half. I was put in the bottom of a fishing trunk. And at that time, when you arrive in Hong Kong, you touch base, you're legalized. And the same night, I was taken to a factory to work as an object worker. In the morning, I smell a lot of food that I never smelled, the great aroma of food. And the manager gave me $10. That was a lot of money at that time, and I was very happy. It's as if I arrived in heaven. It was a very happy time. It was a time that I know I had a future. I know I was chosen.
As the years passed, Jimmy proved himself to be a successful businessman, owning and operating a multi-billion-dollar clothing retail chain called Giordano. Jimmy had successfully left communist China behind, but that changed on June 4th, 1989.
When I first noticed what happened in Tiananmen, I was very moved. I'd always tried to run away from China since the time that I escaped from it. Anything China represents is something that I want to forget because it's something becoming very disgusting for me. The more I learn about the free world outside, all of a sudden, it's like my mother was calling in the darkness of the light. And my heart opened up.
Jimmy became an activist, using his resources to try and push China towards liberty and freedom. In an effort to shut him down, however, Chinese officials forced him to sell his successful clothing company, Giordano. Undeterred, Jimmy continued to write letters and fund protests, but decided the best way to free the people of China was through information and the media. So he started a newspaper company called Apple Daily.
I need a business to motivate me because it's not just a business to make money, but it's a business that I can have a satisfaction of doing something meaningful. In the media business, you deliver information, then you deliver choice, and choice is freedom. I was thrilled by the idea that I can be part of the institution that is delivering freedom. I thought China after the June 4th massacre will be open up to the world and to freedom for its people. It hasn't yet. But not that we don't have to persist. We have to persist, and I'm positive that the day is getting closer and closer. I'm waiting for our media business to go to China one day. I hope I'm not too old to do so.
There's been widespread international condemnation of China following a parliamentary vote to impose new national security laws on Hong Kong.
The new law is expected to deter anything that smacks of criticism of China, protests, speeches, media coverage, things that fueled months of protests last year.
We do want to begin in Hong Kong, where the new national security law has just swept up one of that city's most high-profile critics of Chinese rule. We're talking about media mogul and pro-democracy activist Jimmy Lai. He was arrested this morning at his newspaper office. This was after officers raided the pro-democracy newspaper that he runs. Lai is a prominent critic of the Chinese Communist Party and a backer of the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong.
Lai says his most emotional moment this week was when he was surrounded by supporters after he was freed on bail. During his 40-hour detention, police showed him interviews he did with foreign media as evidence of suspected collusion with foreign forces, a new offence that could put him in jail for life.
I'm 72. I came here without anything. Anything I have is this place. This place is freedom gave me. I owe freedom my life. If I can give myself back to freedom, that will be the greatest redemption of my life.
Jimmy, the Acton Institute tonight is honored to present to you the Faith and Freedom Award. We recognize you for the inspirational witness to liberty that you have given to countless millions around the world. We recognize you for your fortitude in the face of unimaginable odds, and we stand with you and in humble solidarity as you continue the fight for liberty. Presented this day by unanimous acclamation of the Acton Institute's Board of Directors, November 18th, 2020. Congratulations, Jimmy.
Thank you. Thank you for the honor, Father Sirico. This honor will obligate me to do my utmost for Hong Kong in the fight of our rule of law and freedom. I'm very grateful to Hong Kong, which has made me what I am today. I came here with $1, and the freedom here has given me the opportunity to build up myself. And the value that is underlying this freedom is so precious, and that's what exactly we are fighting for in Hong Kong now. I thank Frederick Hyatt for his inspiration for me to determine to fight for freedom in my life. And because I have to fight for freedom, I'm very happy that I have the faith to support it. Because freedom has a price. You may have to go through some hardships. You may lose heart. But with the grace of God, with Him sharing my suffering, I know that I can only become a better person. And I'm free from all those burdens or anxiety. I'm very thankful to be a Catholic. It is always in my mind as a Catholic that God is always my center. And I am always a sinner. And my life is not about myself. If I can accomplish this, I know that I'm living in the grace of God. I know that I will be a better person. Whatever suffer, I have to take it out. Thank you so much, Father Sirico. Thank you so much, Acton Institution. I'm very honored by this award. And I hope I will be able to measure up to it in my future devotion in the fight for the rule of law and freedom. Thank you again.
When you see a man like this who is looking at a potential jail sentence in a Chinese cell, it prompts in us a certain inspiration, but also an awareness that socialism is resilient. The collectivist idea, the idea of dominating other people, politics as the solution to our problems, power tending to corrupt, these are challenges that we are facing in our day and age. You know, Lord Acton, in addition to the famous quote we've alluded to tonight, said that liberty is the delicate fruit of a mature civilization. And I want to say to you that there is reason for hope. And here's the reason. What we're talking about is the truth. And the truth will always bury its undertakers. The truth is real. And the truth about the human person, the truth about the economy, about the necessity of freedom to solve problems, of the right of people to own their property, that all of these kinds of things are the stuff, they make up the stuff of that mature civilization. So in 30 years of seeing the kinds of mistakes made over and over again, the solution is to help people to understand the connections. And we have the means, thanks to technology today, to do this in an unprecedented way. This is what gives me hope. The very technology that can destroy our society is the technology that can save us from the mistakes of the past. And that's why we here at the Acton Institute have not lost an ounce of our zeal and energy to help others to develop ways and ideas and concepts of how to build a society that is worthy of the human person. Understanding our origin in God, understanding our destiny in God, we need to have the freedom to pursue that destiny. I want to thank you very much for all that you have done to make these 30 years possible. You know, in speaking about all of this, we are particularly conscious that we haven't done this alone, and we've had some incredible friends along the way who early on saw what we wanted to do and really in a very practical way helped us to do it. I'm thinking of two people who we asked to represent that part of our family, and that's David Humphreys, who served as the chairman of the board of the Acton Institute, and Heather Higgins, who is one of the smartest entrepreneur philanthropists that I know of.
It is a great pleasure to join you and the many Acton Institute supporters as we come together to congratulate the Institute's founders on their 30th anniversary.
I can't believe it's been 30 years since a charming and earnest priest with a warm smile and hearty laugh paid a visit to our foundation.
I first happened upon Acton Institute at a Liberty Fund conference 29 years ago in 1991 when I met Father Robert and heard his vision for Acton.
First, a mission I believe in, one that strives to make our world better than we found it. Second, a well thought out, organized, and strategic solution to a problem. And finally, results.
The founders made an indelible and profound mark upon the conversation how best to raise people up out of poverty.
Acton identified the fundamental truth to talking compellingly to everyone across the spectrum: human dignity.
I began to support Acton financially, in a small way at first, but eventually making Acton one of my top charitable priorities.
It's been 30 years since I made that initial investment, and I couldn't be more proud.
Accepting an invitation to join its board in 2000, and now serving as Acton's chairman for many years.
That same priest who walked into my office is a beloved friend.
I've also been quite fortunate to develop great relationships with Father Robert and Chris.
And the Acton Institute is an essential player in the fight for limited government, individual freedom, and morality.
Let us raise our glasses to toast.
Raise your glass with me
And honor Father Robert and Chris
to Acton's 30th anniversary,
for their efforts to achieve both a free
and virtuous society.
Well done, good and faithful servants. Thank you both.
And I think now we may need a drink.
We mentioned at the beginning you might have a glass ready, and many of you were kind enough to send in a photo of yourself toasting the 30th anniversary of Acton Institute. I'd invite you now to join us in a literal toast to the great work of Acton. And as I do this, I also want to be sure to
Don't break up the Institute.
To thank our staff, obviously. None of this would be possible without the great work and professionalism of the staff that have been part of this mission for 30 years. Thank you all.
To freedom.
And to the next 30 years.